There is a chisel mark on the forehead of David that Michelangelo never corrected. A small imperfection in marble that would become the most famous sculpture in history. He knew it was there. He chose to leave it. This is not a story about genius. It is a story about control. Michelangelo Buonarroti spent 88 years trying to control stone, patrons, contracts, God's judgment, and his own reputation. He succeeded at almost none of it. What he left behind was not the triumph of individual creativity, but the residue of institutional power channeled through one man's capacity for endurance and refusal. When he died in Rome in 1564, his hands were still scarred from the hammer. His spine had curved from decades bent over marble. His eyes had deteriorated from paint dust and candlelight in enclosed spaces. He owned property, money, and unfinished contracts. The Medici family, 2 popes, and the city of Florence had all claimed ownership of his labor at different points. He had spent more than 4 decades working on a single tomb that was never completed as planned. The Michelangelo we think we know, the solitary genius, the tortured artist, the Renaissance man, is a construction of later centuries. The Romantics needed him to be a rebel. The Modernists needed him to be an individualist. Neither version is accurate. The man who existed was harder to categorize. He was a stonemason's son who apprenticed in a painter's workshop, worked for bankers and popes, and spent most of his life trying to satisfy contracts he resented. He believed his work was service to God, filtered through the institutional church and the men who controlled it. He did not speak of artistic freedom. He spoke of duty, difficulty, and the inadequacy of his own efforts. He worked alone because he trusted no one. He fought with patrons because he could not separate his labor from his identity. He returned obsessively to the same subjects: the human body under strain, unfinished forms, emerging from stone, figures caught between divine command and physical limitation. These were not metaphors. They were the conditions of his working life. Michelangelo was not the first artist to be famous in his lifetime, but he was among the first whose fame became a problem he could not solve. People called him divine while he was still alive. He hated it. Divinity meant distance from the work itself, from the physical action of cutting stone and mixing paint. It turned him into a symbol when all he wanted was to finish what he had started. The projects that made him famous were the ones he tried to avoid. He did not want to paint the Sistine Chapel ceiling. He argued against it, delayed it, complained throughout its execution. It took 4 years of his life and damaged his body. When it was finished, it became the thing people would remember him for, and he spent the next 3 decades trying to return to sculpture, the medium he actually preferred. This is the central tension of his life. The gap between what he wanted to make and what he was forced to make, between his sense of artistic purpose and the institutional machinery that determined where his labor would go. He believed sculpture was the highest form of art because it required direct confrontation with resistant material. Painting was softer, more forgiving, less true. But popes needed painted ceilings, and Michelangelo needed papal commissions. He lived through the sack of Rome, the siege of Florence, the Counter-Reformation, and the consolidation of Medici dynastic power. Each of these events interrupted his work, redirected his contracts, or placed him under political suspicion. Art was never separate from power. Patronage was never neutral. Every commission was a negotiation between what the patron wanted displayed and what the artist could physically produce within the time and resources allocated. Michelangelo understood this. He negotiated hard, delayed strategically, and cultivated his reputation as difficult, because difficulty gave him leverage. But leverage is not freedom. He remained dependent on the men who could afford to hire him, and they remained capable of redirecting his labor toward their own purposes. What follows is not a celebration. It is an examination of how one man's capacity for obsessive work intersected with the political, religious, and economic structures of 16th century Italy. It is about physical endurance, institutional constraint, and the difference between reputation and control. The burden Michelangelo carried was not the burden of genius. It was simpler and heavier. The burden of being exceptionally good at something people with power wanted done, and the inability to stop doing it even when it destroyed his body, his peace, and his ability to finish what he most wanted to make. He began as a boy who could draw and carve better than others. He became an old man, still climbing scaffolding, still arguing with patrons, still trying to make stone do what he needed it to do. In between, he produced work that would be studied, copied, and misunderstood for centuries. This is what actually happened. Michelangelo Buonarroti was born on March 6, 1475, in Caprese, a small administrative town in the Republic of Florence's outer territories. His father, Lodovico di Leonardo Buonarroti Simoni, was a minor government official with declining family wealth and ambitions that exceeded his position. Within months of Michelangelo's birth, Lodovico's term as podesta of Caprese ended, and the family returned to Florence. This context mattered. The Buonarroti family had once held more significant civic roles. By the late 15th century, they were minor nobility without the resources to maintain that status. Lodovico's primary concern was restoring respectability through careful marriages and strategic positions for his sons. Michelangelo, the second of 5 brothers, was not born into artistic circles. He was born into a family trying not to slip further down Florence's rigid social ladder. When Michelangelo showed an early inclination toward drawing, Lodovico resisted. Artistic work was manual labor, beneath the dignity of a family claiming noble lineage, however strained that claim had become. The resistance was not unusual. In 15th century Florence, painters and sculptors were guild members, tradesmen who worked with their hands. The idea of the artist as intellectual, as someone whose work involved mental rather than purely physical effort, was still being negotiated. At 13, Michelangelo was apprenticed to Domenico Ghirlandaio, one of Florence's most successful fresco painters. The apprenticeship contract, dated 1488, still exists. It specified 3 years of training in exchange for wages that increased annually: 6 florins the first year, 8 the second, 10 the third. This was a standard commercial arrangement. Ghirlandaio ran a workshop that produced altarpieces and chapel decorations for churches and wealthy families. Apprentices learned by preparing materials, copying drawings, and gradually taking on more complex tasks. Michelangelo learned the technical foundations of fresco painting in Ghirlandaio's workshop: how to prepare plaster, transfer designs to wet surfaces, work quickly before the plaster dried. He learned compositional structure by copying the master's drawings and studying the work of earlier Florentine painters. The training was rigorous and procedural. There was no emphasis on personal vision or individual style. The goal was competent execution of commissions within established visual conventions. But Michelangelo's interest was already moving toward sculpture. Florence in the 1480s had examples of classical Roman sculpture visible in Medici collections and in fragments embedded in buildings throughout the city. The revival of interest in ancient art was not romantic nostalgia. It was a deliberate political and cultural project by families like the Medici, who used classical references to legitimize their power and present Florence as the heir to Roman civic virtue. After approximately 1 year with Ghirlandaio, not the full 3-year term, Michelangelo moved to the sculpture garden of Lorenzo de' Medici, the de facto ruler of Florence. This was not an apprenticeship in the commercial sense. Lorenzo maintained the garden as a training ground for young sculptors, overseen by the aging sculptor Bertoldo di Giovanni. The purpose was to produce artists who could work in the classical style the Medici family valued. Here, Michelangelo worked directly with marble for the first time in a sustained way. He studied ancient fragments and learned to copy classical forms. One of his earliest surviving works, the Madonna of the Stairs, carved when he was around 15 or 16, shows the influence of ancient Roman relief sculpture in its shallow carving and compositional balance. It is technically accomplished but derivative, exactly what a young sculptor learning through imitation would produce. Lorenzo de' Medici recognized Michelangelo's technical ability and allowed him to live in the Medici household for approximately 2 years. This access was significant. Michelangelo encountered humanist scholars, poets, and philosophers in Lorenzo's circle. He heard discussions of Neoplatonic philosophy, which attempted to reconcile classical thought with Christian theology. These ideas, particularly the notion that physical beauty could reflect divine truth, would later inform his approach to the human figure. But this was not a period of creative freedom. It was intensive training under the scrutiny of powerful patrons who had specific ideas about what art should accomplish. Michelangelo absorbed technique, observed how patronage worked, and learned that proximity to power required careful navigation. When Lorenzo de' Medici died in 1492, the political structure of Florence began to destabilize. Lorenzo's son Piero lacked his father's political skill. The Medici family's control over Florence became increasingly contested. For Michelangelo, this meant the loss of his primary patron and the security that came with Medici protection. He was 17 years old. He had learned fresco painting, marble carving, and classical composition. He had talent, technical skill, and some recognition among Florence's elite. What he did not have was financial independence or long-term security. His training had prepared him to fulfill commissions, not to choose what he wanted to make. The discipline came first. The artistic identity would be constructed later through decades of work under constraint. What Michelangelo wanted was already becoming clear: to work in marble, to study the human body, to make sculpture that engaged with classical forms while serving Christian purposes. But wanting and doing were separated by the need to find patrons willing to pay for that work. He would spend the rest of his life managing that gap. In 1494, Michelangelo left Florence before the political crisis fully erupted. The decision was partly fear, partly calculation. Piero de' Medici's grip on the city was weakening. French armies were moving through northern Italy. The Dominican friar Girolamo Savonarola was gaining influence with his apocalyptic preaching and denunciations of Medici excess. Michelangelo, who had lived in the Medici household and benefited from their patronage, was vulnerable to association. He went first to Venice, briefly, then to Bologna, where he found work completing sculptural figures for the shrine of St. Dominic. The commission was small, 3 marble figures to finish a project another sculptor had left incomplete. It was the kind of work available to a young sculptor without major connections, competent execution of someone else's design. He completed the figures and returned to Florence in 1495. By then, the Medici had been expelled. Savonarola controlled Florence's political and moral climate, railing against luxury, vanity, and secular humanism. The city was tense, economically strained, and religiously fervent. This was not an environment conducive to classical sculpture or Medici-style patronage. Michelangelo found little work. Out of this period came one of his most consequential early deceptions. He carved a sleeping Cupid in classical style, and either on his own initiative or at someone's suggestion, the sculpture was artificially aged and sold in Rome as an ancient work. When the buyer, Cardinal Raffaele Riario, discovered the fraud, he was not angry. He was impressed that a young sculptor could produce work convincing enough to pass as antique. Riario invited Michelangelo to Rome. This was 1496. Michelangelo was 21 years old. Rome was a different market than Florence. The papal court had money, ambition, and a need for artists who could produce works that signaled both Christian authority and engagement with classical culture. Michelangelo arrived with skill but no completed major works to his name. The Cupid incident is instructive. It shows that Michelangelo understood the currency of classical style, that collectors valued the appearance of antiquity enough to pay for convincing imitations. It also shows his willingness to participate in deception when it served his interests. The romantic image of the pure artist is difficult to reconcile with a young sculptor complicit in art fraud, but the latter is what the evidence shows. In Rome, Michelangelo secured his first major commission, the Pietà, ordered by French Cardinal Jean de Belair for his tomb chapel in St. Peter's Basilica. The contract, signed in 1498, specified that the work should be the most beautiful work in marble which exists today in Rome. This was standard contractual language. Patrons often required artists to promise superlative quality, but it also set expectations Michelangelo would hold himself to throughout his career. The Pietà is a young man's demonstration of technical mastery. The subject, Mary holding the dead Christ, was more common in Northern European art than in Italy. Michelangelo's version emphasizes anatomical precision and surface finish. Christ's body is rendered with extreme attention to muscle structure and the physics of lifeless weight. Mary's face is young, idealized, calm. The polished marble surfaces create a sense of soft flesh despite the hardness of the material. This was not innovation. It was exceptional execution of established skills, anatomical accuracy, compositional balance, technical finish. The work impressed because it met the highest standards of craftsmanship, not because it challenged conventions. Michelangelo signed it, the only work he would ever sign, by carving his name on the sash across Mary's chest. The signature suggests anxiety about recognition, a need to claim authorship before someone else could. When the Pietà was completed in 1499, Michelangelo's reputation in Rome was secure. He was known as a sculptor capable of producing classically influenced work that served Christian themes. This reputation led to the commission that would change his career trajectory, the David. In 1501, Michelangelo returned to Florence. The city's political situation had shifted again. Savonarola had been executed in 1498. Florence had established itself as a republic, asserting independence from both Medici control and external domination. The city needed symbols of civic virtue and strength. The Arte della Lana, Florence's wool guild, controlled a massive block of Carrara marble that had been quarried decades earlier and partially worked by another sculptor before being abandoned. The marble was problematic, tall and narrow with existing cuts that limited what could be carved from it. The guild offered the commission to Michelangelo. The subject was to be David, the biblical figure who had become a symbol of Florentine republican virtue. The small city-state, defending itself against larger powers. This commission was civic, not personal. Michelangelo was being hired to produce a public sculpture that would represent Florence's political identity. The constraints were significant: the damaged marble, the predetermined subject, the requirement that the finished work serve Republican propaganda. Within those constraints, Michelangelo had to demonstrate his skill. He worked on the David for approximately 3 years, from 1501 to 1504, largely alone. The statue's colossal scale, over 17 feet tall, required physical strength as well as technical precision. The figure itself shows David before the battle with Goliath, not after. He is tense, watchful, readying himself for action. The body is idealized but anatomically specific: muscles, tendons, veins all rendered with attention to how the body looks under physical tension. When the David was completed, a committee that included Leonardo da Vinci and other prominent artists debated where to place it. The original plan was the cathedral. Instead, it was installed in front of the Palazzo della Signoria, Florence's government building, as an explicitly political symbol. Michelangelo had produced what the Republic needed: a massive, heroic figure that embodied civic strength and vigilance. He was 29 years old. He was famous. And he was trapped by that fame into taking commissions that served other people's purposes. Patrons now expected him to produce works at the level of the David and Pietà. Each success raised the standard he would be held to. Freedom was not part of the arrangement. Michelangelo preferred sculpture because it allowed him to control the process from quarry to finish. In painting, especially fresco, assistants were necessary. In sculpture, particularly the way Michelangelo practiced it, he could work alone. The method was direct carving. Unlike sculptors who built up forms in clay or wax before casting in bronze, Michelangelo cut directly into marble, removing material to reveal the form he believed existed inside the stone. This required absolute certainty about anatomical structure and spatial visualization. A mistake in bronze casting could be corrected by melting and recasting. A mistake in marble was permanent. He selected his own marble from the quarries at Carrara, north of Florence in the Apuan Alps. This was unusual. Most sculptors worked with marble provided by patrons or purchased through intermediaries. Michelangelo traveled to the quarries, inspected blocks personally, and supervised their extraction and transport. This level of control extended the timeline of every project and increased costs, but it gave him confidence in his materials. The Carrara quarries had supplied marble since Roman times. The stone was prized for its fine grain and pure white color, qualities that allowed for precise carving and high polish. Quarrying was dangerous, labor-intensive work. Blocks weighing multiple tons had to be cut from mountainsides, lowered on wooden sledges, transported to the coast, shipped to ports, and then hauled overland to workshops. Each stage involved risk of damage. Michelangelo's insistence on personal selection added weeks or months to project timelines. but it also meant he knew the structural integrity of every block before he began cutting. In his workshop, he worked with specific tools, pointed chisels to rough out forms, toothed chisels to refine surfaces, flat chisels for detail, rasps and pumice for final smoothing. The sequence of tools produced the sequence of the sculpture's emergence, from blocky mass to articulated form to finished surface. Michelangelo's unfinished works, which are numerous, show this process clearly. Figures emerge from unworked stone as if struggling free from their material containment. He often left works unfinished, and the reasons varied. Some projects were interrupted by patrons changing their demands or running out of money. Some were abandoned when Michelangelo lost interest or became obsessed with solving a particular technical problem at the expense of completing the whole. Some remained unfinished because he could not achieve what he wanted within the constraints of the marble block. The concept of non finito, the unfinished as aesthetically intentional, is often applied to Michelangelo's work. This is partly accurate and partly projection. Some of his unfinished sculptures do create a visual tension between emerged and unemerged form that later critics read as expressive choice. But the archival evidence shows that Michelangelo was frequently frustrated by his inability to finish projects, not philosophically committed to leaving them incomplete. After completing the David, Michelangelo was commissioned to create a matching colossal figure, also David or possibly Hercules, and to paint a massive battle fresco for the Florentine town hall. He began neither in a timely way. Instead, he accepted a commission from Pope Julius II that would dominate the next 4 decades of his working life and remain incomplete at his death: the Pope's tomb. Julius II, who became Pope in 1503, wanted a freestanding tomb monument of unprecedented scale, a massive, multi-tiered structure with over 40 life-size marble figures. It would be sculpture as architecture, a mountain of carved stone asserting papal authority. The project appealed to Michelangelo's sculptural ambitions. It was exactly the kind of large-scale, marble-focused work he wanted to make. In 1505, he traveled to Carrara to select marble for the tomb. He spent 8 months in the quarries, choosing blocks and supervising extraction. The scale of the project required enormous quantities of stone. Michelangelo envisioned spending years working through the figures, controlling every aspect of the carving. When he returned to Rome, Julius's priorities had shifted. The Pope was now focused on rebuilding St. Peter's Basilica. Funds were being redirected. The architect Donato Bramante, who had Julius's favor, reportedly encouraged the Pope to delay the tomb project. Michelangelo, who had quarried marble at his own expense expecting papal payment, was left with mounting debts and a patron whose attention had moved elsewhere. This was the mechanism of patronage. Patrons commissioned work based on their current priorities, but those priorities could change according to political circumstances, financial pressures, or the influence of competing artists and advisors. Artists were dependent not just on initial commissions, but on continued patron interest and payment. Michelangelo had no leverage to force Julius to honor the original tomb plan. He could only negotiate, delay, and hope the Pope's focus returned. Instead, Julius insisted that Michelangelo paint the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel. Before that conflict reached its crisis, Michelangelo produced one of his most physically imposing sculptures, Moses, carved for what would become a drastically reduced version of Julius's tomb. The figure shows Moses seated, holding the tablets of law, His head turned as if responding to something outside the frame. The musculature is exaggerated, the beard elaborately carved, the expression intense. The sculpture is not psychologically subtle. It broadcasts power, authority, and barely contained energy. The Moses was carved during a period when Michelangelo knew the original tomb design would never be realized, but had not yet accepted the full extent of the reduction. He worked on figures for the tomb intermittently for decades, always hoping to return to the project in its full conception, always being diverted to other commissions by popes and Medici patrons who controlled his access to money and materials. Sculpture represented control because Michelangelo could shape the material directly without mediation, but he could not control the patrons who determined which sculptures he was allowed to make. The Julius tomb became a perfect symbol of this tension, a project that engaged all his sculptural ambitions, commissioned by the most powerful patron in Christendom, and ultimately unrealizable because that same patron's shifting priorities fragmented Michelangelo's time and focus across multiple, competing demands. The contradiction was structural. The very patrons wealthy and powerful enough to commission major sculptural projects were also the ones whose political and institutional responsibilities pulled them, and therefore their artists, in multiple directions simultaneously. Michelangelo wanted sustained, focused work on large-scale sculpture. His patrons wanted flexibility, responsiveness, and visual propaganda that served their immediate needs. Sculpture gave him control over stone. It gave him no control over the conditions under which he was allowed to work with stone. That distinction would define the rest of his career. The Battle of Cassina was never painted. The commission, awarded in 1504, called for a large-scale fresco depicting a Florentine military victory, to be installed in the Hall of the 500 in the Palazzo Vecchio, opposite a battle fresco by Leonardo da Vinci. Both works were intended as civic propaganda celebrating Florentine martial success. Leonardo was already famous, more than 20 years older than Michelangelo, and established as both artist and intellectual. The commission created a direct, public competition. Both artists produced preparatory cartoons, full-scale drawings on heavy paper that would guide the fresco painting. Michelangelo's cartoon showed Florentine soldiers surprised while bathing in the Arno River, scrambling to arm themselves against a sudden enemy approach. The composition was a study in athletic male bodies in dynamic motion, twisting, reaching, climbing, responding to crisis. The cartoon was displayed publicly and became influential among younger, Florentine artists who studied it as a masterwork of anatomical drawing and compositional energy. But Michelangelo never translated it into fresco. In 1505, he left Florence for Rome to begin work on Julius II's tomb, abandoning the Battle of Cassina before execution. Leonardo also left his battle fresco incomplete, though he had begun painting his before abandoning it due to technical problems with his experimental fresco method. The competition ended without resolution. 2 unfinished works, both casualties of patron demands and artist departures. The episode is revealing. Both artists were willing to abandon civic commissions when more appealing opportunities emerged elsewhere. Neither felt obligated to complete work for the Florentine Republic when papal or Milanese courts offered alternative employment. Civic duty yielded to better-paying, more prestigious patronage. This was standard practice, not exceptional behavior. The incident also shows Michelangelo's relationship with Leonardo. There was no warm collegiality. They represented different approaches. Leonardo, the intellectual investigator, interested in multiple fields and experimental methods. Michelangelo, the focused craftsman, committed to traditional techniques and singular medium mastery. Their aesthetic priorities differed. Leonardo valued sfumato, soft atmospheric transitions, psychological subtlety. Michelangelo valued sculptural clarity, anatomical definition, physical intensity. They were not friends. Florence's artistic community was competitive, structured by workshop rivalries and patron favoritism. Reputations were built partly through visible superiority to other artists. When Leonardo and Michelangelo were both in Florence between 1503 and 1505, they circled each other warily, aware that their work would be compared, and that patron preference could shift based on those comparisons. Florence itself was violent, politically unstable, and economically pressured. The Republic that had expelled the Medici in 1494 was a factional compromise held together by complex voting mechanisms and the military leadership of figures like Piero Soderini, the gonfaloniere who commissioned the battle frescoes. External threats were constant. French armies, Spanish armies, papal armies, shifting Italian alliances. Internal threats included pro-Medici conspiracies, class tensions, and religious extremism. Art was political. Public sculptures and frescoes were not decoration. They were statements about who controlled civic space and what values the city claimed to embody. When Michelangelo's David was installed in front of the Palazzo Vecchio, it was a Republican symbol. When the Medici eventually returned to power, they would reinterpret that same statue to serve dynastic purposes. Michelangelo understood these dynamics. His early work for Lorenzo de' Medici had taught him how art served family prestige. His work for the Republic taught him how it served civic ideology. Both forms of service were transactional. Artists who failed to satisfy patrons lost commissions. Artists who succeeded became more tightly bound to patron expectations. In 1506, after Michelangelo had left for Rome, the Florentine Republic continued to struggle. Pisa, which Florence had conquered, was in revolt. Military campaigns were expensive and largely unsuccessful. The Republic's finances strained. Civic commissions slowed. Artists looked elsewhere for work. When Michelangelo returned to Florence briefly in 1508, it was not to complete the Battle of Cassina. It was to confront the reality that Julius II had summoned him back to Rome to paint the Sistine Chapel ceiling, a project he had tried to avoid by staying in Florence. The Pope sent letters demanding his return. Michelangelo delayed, negotiated, and finally complied. He had no real choice. Refusing a papal commission meant losing access to the single most powerful patron in Italy. Florence's violence was not only military and political, it was also aesthetic. Artists competed for visibility, for limited patron resources, for historical recognition. The culture of competition meant that superior work was necessary not just for artistic satisfaction, but for economic survival. Michelangelo's intensity, his refusal to collaborate, his suspicion of other artists, his compulsive reworking of compositions, was partly temperamental and partly strategic response to an environment where being second best meant being forgotten. The city produced extraordinary art during this period, not because of peace and prosperity, but despite, and partly because of, instability and competition. Patrons needed visual demonstrations of power and legitimacy precisely because their political positions were contested. Artists needed to demonstrate superior skill precisely because opportunities were scarce and rivals were numerous. Michelangelo absorbed this competitive framework. It shaped how he approached commissions, how he guarded his working methods, how he responded to criticism. When Bramante allegedly suggested to Julius II that Michelangelo was unsuited for the Sistine ceiling, Michelangelo interpreted it as professional sabotage, an attempt to engineer his failure and elevate Bramante's position. Whether or not Bramante actually intended this, Michelangelo's suspicion was structurally rational. Artists did undermine each other. Patrons did play favorites. Failure on a major commission could end a career. Florence taught Michelangelo that art was combat by other means. The skills that mattered were technical excellence, patron management, and strategic self-positioning. Artistic vision mattered only insofar as it could be executed within patron parameters and demonstrated superiority to competing artists. When he left Florence for Rome in 1508 to begin the Sistine ceiling, he was leaving the city where he had established his reputation, but also leaving behind commissions he had agreed to and abandoned. The Battle of Cassina would remain a famous cartoon but never become a fresco. The second colossal statue would never be carved. Florence had given him the David and the beginnings of fame. It had also shown him that fame created obligations he resented, and that there was no mechanism to pursue his own artistic priorities outside the structure of patronage competition. Rome was waiting. The ceiling was waiting. Julius was insistent. Michelangelo went, as he always went when patrons with sufficient power demanded it. Michelangelo was a sculptor. He had trained in painting under Ghirlandaio, but had not maintained a painting practice. His reputation rested on the Pietà, the David, and his sculptural skill. When Pope Julius II ordered him to paint the Sistine Chapel ceiling in 1508, Michelangelo resisted. The resistance was practical, not merely temperamental. Fresco painting required specific technical knowledge that Michelangelo had not used in years. The Sistine Chapel ceiling was approximately 5,000 square feet of curved plaster surface, 40 feet above the floor, in a chapel used for papal ceremonies and conclaves. The existing ceiling decoration was simple, a star-filled blue sky. Julius wanted something more ambitious. The original plan was for Michelangelo to paint the 12 apostles in the ceiling's pendentives and fill the remaining space with ornamental designs. Michelangelo proposed an alternative: a complex theological program depicting scenes from Genesis, prophets, Sibyls, and the ancestors of Christ. This was not sudden inspiration. It was negotiation. If he had to paint instead of sculpt, he would at least control the iconographic program. Julius accepted the expanded plan. This meant Michelangelo would be responsible for designing and executing approximately 300 figures across a massive, architecturally complex surface. He had minimal experience with projects of this scale in fresco. He would need to learn by doing. The chapel required scaffolding. Bramante designed a suspended platform that would hang from ropes anchored in the walls. Michelangelo rejected it, arguing it would leave holes in the ceiling once removed. He designed his own platform, a wooden bridge that spanned the chapel and supported itself on brackets inserted into the upper walls. This gave him a working surface, but required him to paint lying on his back or standing with his head tilted backward for hours at a time. He started with assistants. He brought painters from Florence who had experience with fresco technique. They prepared plaster, transferred his designs to the ceiling, and began painting the first figures. Michelangelo was unsatisfied with their work. He dismissed them, plastered over what they had painted, and began again, working almost entirely alone. Fresco technique requires speed and precision. Wet plaster is applied to a section of wall or ceiling, an area small enough to be painted before the plaster dries, usually in a single day. Once dry, the surface cannot be altered without chipping away the plaster and starting over. Pigments mixed with water are applied to the wet plaster. As the plaster dries, the pigments bind chemically to the surface, becoming permanent. This means the painter must work quickly without revision, with complete clarity about composition, color, and execution before beginning each day's section. Mistakes are costly. Hesitation is expensive. The method demands confidence and technical mastery. Michelangelo worked section by section, figure by figure. The ceiling's design is organized around a central spine of 9 scenes from Genesis: the creation, the fall, and the flood. These panels are framed by the painted architectural structure. Around them, larger figures of prophets and sibyls sit in painted thrones. In the corners and triangular spaces, the ancestors of Christ appear in family groupings. The whole surface is unified by a fictive architectural framework painted to appear three-dimensional. The program is dense, theologically structured, and visually overwhelming. It moves from the creation of light to the drunkenness of Noah, from divine order to human failure. The prophets and sibyls represent human channels of divine knowledge. The ancestors represent the human lineage that led to Christ. The entire ceiling presents salvation history from creation to incarnation. Michelangelo's figures are massive, sculptural, and anatomically specific. Unlike the softer, more atmospheric figures, in contemporary painting, his bodies are defined by clear contours, exaggerated musculature, and dynamic poses. They do not blend into their backgrounds. They assert physical presence against the painted architecture. The work took approximately 4 years, from mid-1508 to late 1512. During this time, Michelangelo lived in Rome, climbed the scaffolding daily, and worked in cramped, poorly lit conditions. Paint dripped into his eyes. Plaster dust damaged his respiratory system. His body contorted to reach different sections of the ceiling. He described the physical toll in letters and in a sonnet sent to a friend, detailing his curved spine, his dripping beard, his distorted vision. These were not poetic exaggerations. They were accurate descriptions of occupational injury. Prolonged overhead work causes neck and back damage. Paint containing lead and other toxic pigments causes cumulative health problems. The working conditions were dangerous, and Michelangelo endured them because refusing the commission was not a viable option. Julius visited the chapel periodically to check progress and pressure Michelangelo to work faster. The Pope wanted the ceiling finished. Michelangelo wanted it done properly. These priorities conflicted. The surviving accounts describe tense exchanges where Julius demanded completion dates, and Michelangelo insisted he could not predict when the work would be finished, because quality required time. There is a possibly apocryphal story that Julius threatened to have Michelangelo thrown from the scaffolding if he did not finish soon. Apocryphal or not, it captures the power dynamic. The Pope controlled resources, access, and Michelangelo's reputation. Michelangelo controlled only his labor and his refusal to compromise on execution quality. The ceiling was unveiled in stages. The first half was revealed in August 1511. Michelangelo continued working on the second half. The entire ceiling was completed in October 1512, just before Julius's Death in February 1513. When it was finished, it was immediately recognized as extraordinary. The scale, the compositional complexity, the anatomical precision, all exceeded contemporary painting standards. Michelangelo had demonstrated that he could master a medium he had not preferred and produce work that set new technical benchmarks. But he hated the project. In private correspondence, he complained constantly. The work took him away from sculpture. It ruined his health. It subjected him to Julius's impatience and Bramante's supposed scheming. He painted the ceiling because he had to, not because he wanted to. This is the essential context for understanding the Sistine Chapel ceiling. It is not the product of artistic inspiration freely pursued. It is the product of institutional coercion executed by someone with the technical ability to meet impossible demands. Michelangelo painted it because a pope ordered him to paint it, paid him to paint it, and would have damaged his career if he had refused. The ceiling became his most famous work, the thing tourists and scholars would study for centuries. It made him Michelangelo the painter in public memory, even though he spent the rest of his life trying to return to sculpture. The gap between what he wanted to make and what he became famous for making was never resolved. After the ceiling was finished, Michelangelo returned to the Julius tomb, hoping to finally complete the sculptural project he had quarried marble for 7 years earlier. But Julius was dead, and the tomb commission passed to his heirs, who had different priorities and less money. The project would be renegotiated, reduced, and delayed for 3 more decades. The ceiling had consumed 4 years. It had proven his capacity to execute any commission, no matter how unsuited to his skills or preferences. That proof would be used by future patrons to justify ever more demanding projects, ever longer diversions from sculpture, ever greater physical and temporal costs. Pain was structural to Michelangelo's work, not incidental. The tools, materials, and methods he used produced predictable physical damage over time. Marble dust damages lungs. Prolonged overhead painting damages spine and vision. Heavy hammering damages hands and wrists. He knew this. He continued anyway. The famous sonnet he wrote to Giovanni da Pistoia during the Sistine ceiling work describes his body's deformation. His spine curving backward, his beard pointing skyward, paint dripping onto his face, his vision distorted from looking upward for months. The poem is often read as humorous complaint. It is more accurately read as documentary evidence of occupational injury deliberately incurred in service of completing a commission. After finishing the ceiling, Michelangelo did not rest. He returned to Florence in 1512, shortly before the Medici family violently reclaimed control of the city, ending the Republic. The Medici restoration was brutal. Opponents were killed or exiled. The political structures that had commissioned Michelangelo's David were dismantled. The family that had first provided him with training and patronage was back in power. This created opportunity and danger. Michelangelo had worked for the Republic. He had accepted commissions from the very governmental structure the Medici had just destroyed. But he had also lived in Lorenzo de' Medici's household as a teenager. The family could claim him, or they could punish him. His response was strategic ambiguity. He accepted Medici commissions while maintaining connections to exiled Republicans. The new Medici Pope, Leo X, who was Lorenzo's son and had known Michelangelo in youth, commissioned him to design a facade for the Church of San Lorenzo in Florence. This was architectural work, not sculpture or painting. Michelangelo had no training in architecture. He learned by studying ancient Roman buildings and consulting with builders. The San Lorenzo facade project consumed 3 years of planning, model making, and quarrying marble before Leo canceled it in 1520, having spent significant funds with nothing built. This pattern, enormous effort on commissions that were then canceled or drastically altered, repeated throughout Michelangelo's career. Patrons commissioned work enthusiastically, then withdrew support due to budget constraints, political changes, or shifting priorities. Each cancellation left Michelangelo with time and money invested in projects that would never be completed, and with damaged relationships with quarry workers, assistants, and contractors who had expected sustained employment. The Julius tomb remained unfinished. The heirs of Julius II periodically demanded progress. Michelangelo periodically promised to focus on it, then was diverted by papal commissions that took precedence. In 1516, the contract was renegotiated for a smaller tomb. In 1532, it was renegotiated again for an even smaller version. Each renegotiation represented a reduction in Michelangelo's original vision and an admission that the project would never achieve its intended scale. He carved several figures intended for various versions of the tomb during the 1510s and 1520s. The dying slave and rebellious slave show male bodies in states of physical constraint and struggle. The figures are not illustrative of specific narratives. They are studies in anatomy under tension. Muscles straining, bodies twisting, forms emerging incompletely from rough stone. These sculptures are often read as metaphors for the soul's imprisonment in matter, reflecting Neoplatonic philosophy. They are equally readable as products of a sculptor obsessively working through technical problems. How to show maximum physical tension within a single static figure. How to carve forms that appear to be struggling against their own material substrate. Michelangelo worked long hours alone in workshops filled with marble dust. He ate irregularly, slept poorly, and resented interruptions. Letters from friends and family describe him as difficult, suspicious, and consumed by work. This was not romantic artistic temperament. It was the psychological effect of decades spent under contradictory pressures. To finish commissions quickly, to maintain quality standards, to satisfy patrons with incompatible demands, to guard his reputation while accepting work he did not want to do. The physical environment of his workshops was hazardous. Marble carving produces fine dust that, when inhaled over years, causes silicosis and other respiratory diseases. Workshops had minimal ventilation. Michelangelo carved for hours daily from his 20s through his 80s. The cumulative lung damage was inevitable. He also suffered from kidney stones, a condition that caused severe periodic pain and was likely exacerbated by dehydration from working long hours in dusty conditions without adequate water intake. The surviving letters include references to urinary problems, pain during stone passage, and periods of incapacitation. None of this stopped the work. If anything, physical deterioration intensified his focus. As his body became less reliable, he worked harder to compensate, to finish projects before capability failed entirely. The obsession was partly temperamental and partly rational response to the knowledge that patronage could end at any moment, through patron death, political change, or the artist's own physical collapse. In 1527, Rome was sacked by mutinous imperial troops. The city was looted, churches were desecrated, and the population was subjected to months of violence. Pope Clement VII, another Medici family member, was trapped in Castel Sant'Angelo during the siege. Michelangelo was in Florence, but the sack disrupted patronage networks and demonstrated the fragility of papal power. Florence itself soon came under siege. In 1529, imperial and papal forces surrounded the city to restore full Medici control after a brief Republican resurgence. Michelangelo, who had accepted a role fortifying the city's defenses, was again caught between Republican loyalty and Medici patronage. When the city fell in 1530, he went into hiding, fearing Medici retribution. Instead, Clement VII pardoned him and ordered him back to work on the Medici Chapel, a funerary monument in San Lorenzo. Michelangelo spent the 1530s carving tombs for Medici family members, combining architecture, sculpture, and allegorical figures. The chapel was never completed as designed, but the finished portions include some of his most formally complex sculpture: day, night, dawn, and dusk. Allegorical figures representing time's passage, carved with exaggerated anatomy and impossible poses that prioritize visual dynamism over physical plausibility. He also began the Laurentian Library Vestibule, an architectural space designed to house the Medici manuscript collection. The staircase he designed is sculptural rather than purely functional, massive, flowing, visually dramatic. It shows Michelangelo translating his sculptural sensibility into architectural space. But architecture, like painting, was not what he most wanted to do. He wanted to carve marble. Every architectural or painting commission was time not spent on sculpture. Every delay or cancellation of sculptural projects was a source of frustration. The letters from this period show increasing bitterness about patron demands, increasing complaints about health, and increasing awareness that time was running out to complete the work he actually cared about. The pain was not metaphorical. It was inflammation, stone passage, respiratory distress, spinal curvature, joint damage. The obsession was not mysterious. It was the response of someone who had one exceptional skill, knew that skill was time-limited, and watched that time being consumed by commissions imposed by others. Michelangelo's relationship with patrons was never collaborative. It was adversarial negotiation conducted within strict power constraints. He pushed back when possible, complied when necessary, and resented both. The patronage system in early 16th century Italy was feudal in structure. Artists were dependent on wealthy patrons. Popes, cardinals, monarchs, urban oligarchs, who commissioned work, controlled payment, and could destroy reputations through public criticism or withdrawal of support. Artists had limited leverage. Their primary tool was reputation. If an artist was sufficiently famous, patrons competed for access, which created marginal negotiating room. Michelangelo achieved this level of fame early with the David, and consolidated it with the Sistine ceiling. By the 1520s, he was the most sought-after sculptor in Italy. This did not give him freedom. It gave him the ability to delay, complain, and occasionally refuse minor commissions, while still having to accept major ones from sufficiently powerful patrons. Pope Clement VII, who ruled from 1523 to 1534, was particularly demanding. As a Medici, he felt entitled to Michelangelo's labor. He commissioned the Medici Chapel, the Laurentian Library, and other projects simultaneously, then expressed frustration when progress was slow. Michelangelo, working on multiple projects with limited assistance, could not satisfy all demands simultaneously. Clement interpreted delays as insubordination. Michelangelo interpreted Clement's impatience as failure to understand the physical requirements of marble carving and architectural construction. The conflict was structural. Patrons measured success by visible completion of prestigious projects. Artists measured success by quality of execution within material constraints. These metrics were incompatible. Fast completion usually meant compromised quality or extensive use of assistance. High quality meant slow progress and personal execution. Michelangelo prioritized quality and personal control, which guaranteed patron dissatisfaction with his timelines. He also refused to work transparently. He covered his sculptures while in progress, preventing patrons and other artists from seeing unfinished work. This was partly protective. Competitors could not study his methods, and partly psychological. He did not want judgment on incomplete work, but it frustrated patrons who wanted evidence that their money was producing results. When Paul III became pope in 1534, Michelangelo was 59 years old. Paul was a Farnese, not a Medici, which changed the political dynamics. He wanted Michelangelo's labor for Farnese projects, particularly the Pauline chapel frescoes and continuation of work on St. Peter's Basilica. He also inherited the ongoing Julius tomb situation, which was still unresolved more than 2 decades after Julius's death. Paul resolved it by ordering a drastically reduced version of the tomb and threatening legal action if Michelangelo did not complete it. The final version, installed in San Pietro in Vincoli in 1545, bears almost no resemblance to the 1505 design. It is a wall monument with 7 figures instead of a freestanding structure with over 40. The only sculpture entirely by Michelangelo's hand is the Moses. The others were carved by assistants under his supervision or after his designs. This was humiliating. The project that had represented Michelangelo's sculptural ambitions for 4 decades was finished as a compromise, diminished in scale and partly executed by other hands. He received final payment and legal release from the contract. He never spoke of the tomb positively afterward. Michelangelo's pride was not vanity. It was professional identity. He believed his work was technically superior to his contemporaries, and the evidence supported this belief. But technical superiority did not translate to control over his working conditions or freedom to choose projects. Pride became a source of suffering because it made compromise psychologically intolerable, while patronage structures made compromise practically unavoidable. His conflicts with other artists were similarly rooted in professional competition and personal sensitivity to criticism. When Biagio da Cesena, the papal master of ceremonies, criticized the nudity in the Last Judgment fresco, Michelangelo painted him into the scene as Minos in hell, with donkey ears and a serpent biting his genitals. This was not playful. It was visual retaliation against someone who had publicly questioned his artistic judgment. Raphael, who died in 1520, represented a different aesthetic approach, graceful, harmonious, collaborative. He ran a large workshop, delegated extensively, and produced enormous quantities of work in painting, architecture, and decorative arts. His style was more palatable to patrons who wanted elegance over intensity. Michelangelo saw this as superficiality. Raphael's followers saw Michelangelo's muscular, contorted figures as excessive and mannered. This was not just personal animosity. It was aesthetic conflict embedded in institutional competition. The papal court had limited commissions. Artists competed for them. Different styles appealed to different patron preferences. Michelangelo's refusal to soften his approach or accommodate patron taste for gentler imagery limited his options while also protecting his artistic identity. He could not separate the work from his sense of self. This made negotiation difficult. When patrons requested changes, Michelangelo often interpreted these as personal attacks rather than practical adjustments. When other artists were given commissions he wanted, he saw it as conspiratorial undermining rather than patron preference. Some of this was justified. There is evidence that Bramante tried to sabotage Michelangelo's reputation with Julius II. There is evidence that some patrons played artists against each other to extract better terms. But Michelangelo's suspicion exceeded what the evidence warranted. He saw conspiracy where there was often just ordinary institutional politics. The pride that made him defend his artistic standards also made him vulnerable to manipulation. Patrons learned that public praise combined with private pressure could extract work Michelangelo would otherwise refuse. Calling him divine, while simultaneously threatening legal action if he did not deliver, was effective strategy. Michelangelo responded to praise by doubling down on quality standards, which meant accepting commissions to prove his capability, which trapped him in cycles of obligatory labor. Power remained with the patrons. Michelangelo could complain, delay, and demand better terms, but he could not refuse the Pope, refuse the Medici, or refuse powerful cardinals without ending his career. His pride gave him the courage to push back within the system. It did not give him the power to escape the system. By his 60s, he was famous, financially secure, and still dependent on patronage for major projects. The contradiction defined his late career. He was celebrated as divinely gifted while functionally employed by institutional Catholicism to produce visual propaganda. He was praised for individual genius while working within rigid iconographic programs determined by Counter-Reformation theology. The conflict was permanent. Resolution was impossible. He continued working. Michelangelo's religious belief was sincere and conventional. He accepted Catholic doctrine, attended Mass, feared divine judgment, and understood art as service to God mediated through the Church. There is no evidence he questioned basic theological premises or saw himself as spiritually independent from institutional Christianity. This matters because later interpretations often project modern spiritual individualism onto Michelangelo. Reading his work as personal religious exploration separate from church authority. The archival evidence does not support this. His religious practice was observant, traditional, and embedded in the sacramental and institutional structures of 16th century Catholicism. He belonged to religious confraternities, lay organizations dedicated to prayer, charity, and mutual support. He commissioned masses for deceased family members. He made pilgrimage to holy sites. His correspondence includes conventional expressions of sin, unworthiness, and hope, for salvation through divine mercy. These were not artistic poses. They were standard Catholic practice. His approach to religious subject matter in art reflected this orthodoxy. The iconographic programs he worked with, the Sistine ceiling, the Last Judgment, the Pauline chapel frescoes, were determined by theological advisors, not by Michelangelo's personal spiritual vision. His job was to translate approved theological content into visual form, not to innovate doctrinally. Where he had interpretive freedom was in formal execution, how to compose scenes, how to render bodies, how to create visual emphasis. But the content itself, which biblical episodes to depict, which saints to include, which theological points to emphasize, was dictated by patrons and their clerical advisors. The Sistine Chapel ceilings program was developed in consultation with theologians. The Genesis scenes, the prophets and sibyls, the ancestors of Christ, all followed established typological traditions, linking Old Testament events to New Testament salvation. Michelangelo's contribution was making these theological relationships visually legible through compositional structure and figural emphasis. The Last Judgment, painted on the altar wall of the Sistine Chapel between 1536 and 1541, was commissioned by Paul III as part of the Counter-Reformation's visual program. The Protestant Reformation had challenged Catholic authority. The Church responded with doctrinal clarification, institutional discipline, and visual propaganda emphasizing themes the Reformers contested: the authority of the Church, the intercession of saints, the reality of purgatory, the necessity of good works. The Last Judgment is an enormous fresco depicting Christ's return and the final separation of saved and damned. Christ sits in judgment at the center, surrounded by saints displaying the instruments of their martyrdom. Below, the dead rise from graves. Angels trumpet the apocalypse. The saved ascend on the left. The damned descend on the right toward hell, where Charon ferries souls and Minos judges. At the bottom, the damned experience eternal torment. The iconography follows established Christian eschatology. Michelangelo's innovation was scale and intensity. The figures are massive, muscular, agitated. Christ is not a gentle shepherd, but a powerful judge whose raised hand signals irreversible condemnation. The saved do not float peacefully heavenward. They struggle upward, assisted by angels. The damned do not simply fall. They are dragged, beaten, and consumed by demons. The overall effect is visual intensity bordering on chaos. Bodies overlap, twist, push against each other. The composition is densely packed with nearly 400 figures. There is no atmospheric depth, no landscape, minimal sky, just bodies, judgment, and stark division between salvation and damnation. This was theologically appropriate for the Counter-Reformation moment. The Church wanted emphasis on judgment, the consequences of sin, and the necessity of sacramental grace mediated through Church authority. Michelangelo delivered precisely that, rendered with anatomical precision and compositional force that made the theological content viscerally present. But the nudity became a problem. Michelangelo had painted most figures nude or minimally draped, following his usual practice of foregrounding anatomy. In the context of the altar wall in the Pope's personal chapel, this generated criticism. Some clerics argued the nudity was inappropriate for sacred space, potentially distracting from devotional purposes. After Michelangelo's death, the Council of Trent's decrees on sacred art formalized objections to excessive nudity in religious contexts. Pope Pius IV ordered drapery painted over the genitals of Michelangelo's figures. Daniele da Volterra, a student of Michelangelo, was hired to add the covering draperies, earning him the nickname Il Braghettone, the breeches maker. This posthumous censorship reveals the tension between artistic practice and institutional regulation. Michelangelo had understood his anatomical rendering as revealing divine creation, the human body as evidence of God's design. Church authorities in the Counter-Reformation period increasingly viewed nudity as a potential occasion for sin, requiring regulation even in sacred art. Michelangelo did not live to see most of the draperies added, but he was aware of the criticism. His response was not to defend artistic freedom, but to assert that his intention was pious. He was not making a secular claim to creative autonomy. He was making a religious claim that his representation of the body served devotional purposes. During the 1540s and 1550s, Michelangelo's personal religious practice intensified. He became close to Vittoria Colonna, a poet and religious reformer whose circle included figures interested in reform within Catholic orthodoxy. This movement emphasized personal faith, scripture, reading, and justification by faith, ideas that echoed Protestant concerns while remaining within Catholic communion. Michelangelo's late poems and letters show increased preoccupation with sin, judgment, and salvation. He expressed doubt about the sufficiency of his own works, both artistic and moral, for salvation. He emphasized reliance on divine grace. These themes were conventional in Catholic piety, but took on particular urgency for an aging artist confronting mortality. His late religious drawings, made for private devotion rather than commissions, show stripped-down compositions focused on Christ's suffering. The crucifixion drawings are spare, emphasizing the physical agony of execution without elaborate settings or additional figures. They are devotional tools, meant to focus meditation on Christ's sacrifice. This was not spiritual rebellion. It was intensified orthodoxy. Michelangelo was conforming more strictly to Counter-Reformation emphases on personal piety, examination of conscience, and consciousness of sin. The Church was tightening doctrinal boundaries. Michelangelo was tightening his own religious observance in response. His architectural work on St. Peter's Basilica, which occupied his final 2 decades, was explicitly framed as service to God. He refused payment, calling the work an act of devotion. This was partly practical. He was financially secure and did not need the money, but also theological. He understood the basilica as the physical center of Catholic Christianity, the architectural expression of church authority and continuity. The design challenges were immense. He inherited a partially built structure from previous architects, with foundations and structural elements already in place that constrained his options. He had to work within these limitations while creating a coherent design for the dome and overall structure. The dome he designed, a massive, ribbed structure inspired by Brunelleschi's Florence Cathedral, dome was not completed until after his death, but his design determined its final form. He worked on St. Peter's despite failing health, increasing isolation, and the knowledge that he would not see it finished. This was obligation, not inspiration. The Church needed the basilica completed. He had the skill to design it. Refusing was not an option he considered. Faith for Michelangelo was not mystical experience or personal enlightenment. It was obedience to divine will as communicated through church authority, scripture, and tradition. It was consciousness of sin and unworthiness. It was hope for mercy despite inadequacy. It was work undertaken as devotional obligation. The art he made in service of this faith was technically extraordinary and emotionally intense, but it was always institutional art, created within parameters set by ecclesiastical authority, for purposes defined by the Church's mission. The genius was technical and formal. The content was orthodox. The Last Judgment covers the entire altar wall of the Sistine Chapel, roughly 45 feet tall and 40 feet wide. It is the largest single fresco Michelangelo ever painted. He began work in 1536 at age 61 and completed it in 1541. 5 years of sustained labor on a vertical surface in a chapel he had already painted 2 decades earlier. The commission came from Pope Paul III, but the decision to paint the altar wall had been made by Clement VII before his death. This meant Michelangelo had little choice in accepting it. 2 popes, sequential, both demanding the same project. Refusal would have required extraordinary justification. The wall had previously contained frescoes by Perugino, including an altarpiece and other 15th century works. These were destroyed to prepare the surface for Michelangelo's fresco. This was not unusual. Patrons regularly ordered destruction of earlier art to make room for new commissions. But it indicates the priorities. Current papal prestige mattered more than preserving recent predecessors' work. Michelangelo's design departed from traditional Last Judgment iconography in several ways. Most earlier versions organized the scene into clear horizontal registers: Christ and saints at top, resurrection in middle, hell at bottom. Michelangelo compressed and swirled the composition. Figures overlap across zones. The saved and damned intermingle in the lower portions. The overall movement is rotational rather than stratified. Christ is centered but not elevated above the action. He is surrounded by figures in close proximity, creating density rather than hierarchical separation. His gesture, right arm raised, left lowered, drives the compositional movement. The saved respond to his right side, drawn upward. The damned react to his left, pushed downward. But the division is not clean. Bodies tangle, overlap, interfere with each other. The Virgin Mary sits beside Christ, turning away as if unable to watch the judgment. This detail, Mary's averted face, breaks with tradition showing her interceding for humanity. Here she is passive, accepting the judgment without intervention. The theological implication is that at the end of time, intercession is finished. Judgment is final. The saints surrounding Christ hold instruments of their martyrdom: Saint Catherine with her wheel, Saint Sebastian with arrows, Saint Bartholomew with his flayed skin. Michelangelo painted his own face on Bartholomew's skin, a self-portrait as emptied flesh, separated from the body. This is often interpreted as personal despair or dark humor. It is more straightforwardly read as conventional Christian meditation on bodily corruption and the inadequacy of earthly life. The resurrection scene at the bottom shows bodies emerging from earth and graves, reconstituting themselves for judgment. Skeletons gain flesh. Separated parts rejoin. This follows Orthodox Christian eschatology. At the end of time, the dead are bodily resurrected to face judgment in physical form. Michelangelo renders this with anatomical specificity. Bodies in various stages of reconstruction, some skeletal, some partially fleshed, some complete. The damned descend on the right side toward hell, depicted as a dark opening where Charon rows souls across the river Styx. This is a classical reference. Charon is from Greek mythology, not Christian scripture, but Dante had included him in the Inferno, making him available for Christian use. Minos, also from Dante, judges souls in hell wrapped in a serpent. The demons dragging the damned are physical, muscular figures, not fantastical monsters. They beat, pull, and force souls downward. The damned resist, struggle, cover their faces. The physicality is emphasized. This is bodily suffering, not abstract spiritual punishment. The fresco contains approximately 390 figures. Most are nude or minimally draped. Michelangelo painted genitals, breasts, musculature without modesty. This was consistent with his practice. He understood anatomy as a divine creation worthy of representation, but it violated developing counter-Reformation sensibilities about appropriate religious imagery. The criticism began even before the fresco's completion. Biagio da Cesana's complaint about nudity led to his inclusion as Minos. But the objection was not merely one official's prudishness. It reflected broader institutional concern that religious art should direct viewers toward devotion, not distraction. Nudity risked the latter. After Michelangelo's death, the debate continued. Some argued for destroying the fresco entirely. Others argued for selective covering. The compromise was drapery painted over genitals and some female breasts. This censorship continued sporadically for decades, with different popes ordering different levels of covering. Modern restoration has removed some later draperies, but retained others too integrated with Michelangelo's original paint to separate. The Last Judgment's intensity, its crowded composition, muscular figures, and emphasis on physicality reflects both Michelangelo's aesthetic commitments and counter-Reformation theological priorities. The Church wanted emphasis on judgment, divine justice, and the consequences of sin. Michelangelo delivered this through bodily representation. Bodies struggling, falling, suffering, or ascending, based on divine verdict. There is no sentimentality. The saved do not look peaceful. They look relieved, anxious, aware of how close they came to damnation. The damned do not look merely sad. They look terrified, desperate, experiencing active torment. Christ does not look merciful. He looks powerful, executing judgment with physical force suggested by his muscular build and decisive gesture. The overall theological message is clear. Judgment is real, final, and based on criteria humans must take seriously during earthly life. The Church mediates access to salvation through sacraments. Reject or neglect the Church's guidance, and damnation follows. This was precisely what the Counter-Reformation needed, communicated visually to counter Protestant claims that Church authority was unnecessary for salvation. Michelangelo painted this message with technical mastery that made it viscerally present. The figures are anatomically convincing. The composition creates visual movement that draws the eye through the scene. The scale overwhelms. Standing in the Sistine Chapel facing the altar wall, the viewer confronts an image of judgment that occupies the entire visual field. This was the fresco's purpose: to make divine judgment inescapable, immediate, and serious. It succeeded. It also contributed to Michelangelo's reputation as unmatched in figural painting, capable of composing hundreds of bodies in dynamic, coherent relationship despite minimal spatial depth. But the work cost him. 5 years of climbing scaffolding in his 60s. 5 years of painting overhead or on a vertical surface in poor light, breathing paint and plaster dust. His letters from this period mention fatigue, pain, and frustration with the slow pace of work. His body was deteriorating. The work continued anyway. When it was finished in 1541, it was immediately controversial and immediately celebrated. The controversy centered on propriety. The celebration centered on technical achievement. Both responses were legitimate. The fresco violated emerging standards for religious art while demonstrating unmatched skill in composition and anatomy. Paul III was satisfied. Michelangelo had delivered what was requested, a monumental representation of Last Judgment that asserted Catholic theological authority through visual force. The patron's purposes were served. Michelangelo's purposes, whatever they were beyond fulfilling the commission, remained subordinate to institutional requirements. He would paint one more set of frescoes in the Pauline Chapel, showing the conversion of Paul and the crucifixion of Peter. They are less famous, more austere in composition, darker in tone. Then he stopped painting. The last 2 decades of his life would focus on architecture and sculpture, returning to the media he preferred. But those decades would not be free from patronage demands, institutional obligations, or the physical limitations of an aging body. Trying to continue work it could not abandon. By his 70s, Michelangelo lived mostly alone in Rome. He owned property in Florence, but rarely visited. His family, brothers, nephews, maintained contact through letters focused on business matters, inheritance, and property management. The correspondence shows transactional relationships, not intimacy. He had outlived most of his early contemporaries. Leonardo had died in 1519, Raphael in 1520, Bramante in 1514. The artists he had competed with, resented, or measured himself against were gone. The younger generation of artists, Vasari, Cellini, others, treated him with deference bordering on reverence, which created distance rather than connection. Vittoria Colonna, the poet and religious reformer who had been his closest companion in the 1540s, died in 1547. Her death affected him deeply. The letters and poems following her death express grief and increased consciousness of mortality. She had been one of the few people he trusted enough to share unfinished work and discuss religious questions. After her death, his isolation intensified. He continued working. The St. Peter's Commission occupied much of his time, designing architectural details, supervising construction, arguing with contractors and Vatican officials about structural decisions. He refused payment for this work, framing it as devotional service. But he was also protecting his design vision, fighting to ensure the basilica would be built according to his plans after his death. The fear was justified. Architectural projects outlived individual architects. If Michelangelo's design was altered or abandoned after his death, decades of work would be compromised. He tried to create institutional momentum, detailed models, clear drawings, written explanations that would constrain future changes. But he knew architects after him would have their own ideas and patrons with different priorities. He also returned to sculpture, working on projects without commissions for private purposes. The late Pietà sculptures, the Florence Pietà and the Rondinini Pietà, were not commissioned works. They were personal projects carved intermittently over years, left unfinished, and worked on primarily for Michelangelo's own reasons. The Florence Pietà shows Christ's body being lowered from the cross, supported by the Virgin Mary, Mary Magdalene, and Nicodemus. Michelangelo carved his own features into Nicodemus's face. He intended this sculpture for his own tomb. But he was dissatisfied with the marble. It had flaws, cracks that interfered with carving. In frustration, he attacked the sculpture with a hammer, breaking Christ's left leg and arm. A student later repaired the damage and finished the Mary Magdalene figure. The work remains fragmentary, showing Michelangelo's late style. Rough surfaces, incomplete emergence of forms from stone, emphasis on physical collapse and support. The Rondinini Pietà, worked on in the final years of his life, is even more radical in its departure from finished classicism. Christ and Mary are fused in a single vertical form. Proportions are elongated, features barely articulated. Michelangelo reworked the sculpture multiple times, cutting away earlier versions to create new forms. The surface is rough, the bodies almost abstract in their reduction to essential gesture. These late works show artistic priorities liberated from patron demands but constrained by failing physical capacity. Michelangelo could barely lift the hammer. His hands were arthritic, his vision poor, his strength diminished. The sculptures could not be technically refined because he no longer had the physical capability for extended fine carving. They are unfinished not by choice but by necessity. His daily routine was work-focused and austere. He ate simply, slept little, and avoided social obligations. Visitors reported finding him in his workshop at night, working by candlelight, often having forgotten to eat. This was not romantic artistic obsession. It was the behavior of someone who had structured his entire life around work and had no other framework for spending time. The loneliness was partly chosen. He preferred solitude to the demands of social interaction, and partly imposed by the difficulty of his personality. He was suspicious, quick to perceive insult, slow to forgive. Friendships required maintenance he was unwilling to provide. Apprentices found him exacting and critical. Patrons found him resistant. Family found him demanding. But the isolation was also structural. At his level of fame, normal social relationships were distorted by reputation. People approached him as Michelangelo the divine artist, not as a person with ordinary human needs. Deference prevented genuine connection. He was admired, celebrated, and fundamentally alone. The physical deterioration was relentless. Beyond the arthritis and vision problems, he suffered from kidney stones, urinary difficulties, and digestive problems. The letters to his nephew Leonardo include requests for specific foods, wines, and medications. They also include complaints about Roman doctors and expressions of resignation about physical decline. He kept working on St. Peter's into his 80s. The dome design was his final major architectural achievement. He would not live to see it built. Construction began on the dome only after his death, but the design was sufficiently developed that later architects followed it closely. This was a kind of immortality. His vision realized in stone after his body had failed. In his final years, Michelangelo wrote poems confronting mortality and divine judgment. The verses are not technically sophisticated, he was not a trained poet, but they are direct expressions of religious anxiety. He wrote of wasted time, insufficient repentance, and hope for mercy despite unworthiness. These themes were conventional in Christian deathbed piety, but the urgency was personal. The last sculpture he worked on was the Rondanini Pietà. He carved on it days before his death, standing in his workshop despite weakness, making small adjustments to forms that would remain incomplete. When he could no longer stand, he stopped. There was no dramatic final statement, no symbolic laying down of tools. He simply became too weak to continue. In February 1564, he developed a fever and took to bed. He died on February 18th, age 88, in his house in Rome. His nephew, Leonardo, was present, as were a few close associates. There was no large gathering, no public deathbed scene. He died as he had worked, privately, surrounded by few people, focused until capacity failed. The body was initially buried in Rome, but Leonardo arranged to have it transported secretly to Florence. The Florentine elite wanted Michelangelo's remains in Florence, the city that claimed him despite his decades in Rome. His tomb was eventually placed in Santa Croce, with elaborate monuments and memorials emphasizing his Florentine identity and divine genius. The memorializing began immediately. Vasari, who had revised his Lives of the Artists while Michelangelo was still alive, published a definitive version emphasizing Michelangelo's supremacy. The myth construction had started during his lifetime. His death accelerated it. Michelangelo spent his life trying to control his work and failed. The Julius tomb was never completed as designed. The San Lorenzo facade was never built. The Battle of Cassina was never painted. The Medici chapel was never finished. Projects were canceled, contracts were renegotiated, designs were altered by later artists after his death. The only control that held was technical. No one could challenge the quality of his execution within the pieces he did complete. The anatomical precision, the compositional force, the surface finish on completed marble. These met the standards he set. But meeting his own technical standards did not mean completing projects as envisioned. The St. Peter's Dome is instructive. Michelangelo designed it, created detailed models, and worked on structural preparations. But the actual dome was built after his death by Giacomo della Porta and others, who modified the design in significant ways. The outer shell was made more pointed than Michelangelo's, hemispherical design, changing the visual profile. This was structural decision-making. The modified design was more stable, but it meant the finished building departed from Michelangelo's vision. He could not control this. Dead architects cannot enforce their designs. The institutional machinery moved forward with practical adjustments that prioritized stability and budget over fidelity to original conception. This was predictable. Michelangelo had known it would happen. He tried to prevent it through detailed documentation. It was insufficient. The same pattern repeated across projects. The Last Judgment was censored. The Rondinini Pietà was left in his workshop, unfinished, eventually acquired by collectors and displayed as fragmentary relic. The drawings and models for unrealized projects were dispersed. His working methods were studied, copied, and adapted by students who claimed his authority while producing work that would have frustrated him. What he did control, ultimately, was the training of his own hands. The thousands of hours spent carving marble created muscle memory, technical capability, and judgment that could not be replicated by others. The specific pressure needed to split marble along grain lines, the angle of chisel against stone that produces clean cuts versus fractures, the sequence of roughing and refining that reveals form efficiently. This knowledge died with him. Apprentices could learn principles, but not the accumulated physical intelligence of decades cutting stone. This is why his unfinished sculptures are so valuable to scholars. They show his actual working process, the marks of specific tools, the sequence of decision-making embedded in the stone surface. But this control was limited to the physical act of carving. It did not extend to which projects received funding, how long he could work on them before being redirected to other commissions, or what happened to his work after completion. Patrons moved sculptures to different locations, altering their visual context. Later, artists added drapery to his frescoes. Churches modified chapels containing his work. The fame that seemed to give him power actually constrained him further. Because he was Michelangelo the Divine, patrons felt entitled to demand his labor for their most ambitious projects. Because his work was recognized as exceptional, it became institutionally valuable, which meant institutions claimed ownership of it and made decisions about its use without consulting artistic intent. The letters from his final decades show awareness of this. He repeatedly expressed resignation about not finishing the work he most wanted to make. He described himself as old, tired, and trapped by obligations. He continued accepting commissions partly because refusing powerful patrons was not practical, and partly because he had no other framework for living. Work was identity. Without commissions, he would have been a wealthy, retired sculptor with nothing to do. The tragedy is not romantic. It is structural. The patronage system that enabled monumental projects also prevented sustained focus on individual artistic priorities. The fame that brought commissions also brought obligations that consumed the time needed to fulfill earlier promises. The physical capability that made him valuable to patrons deteriorated, while demand for his labor remained constant. Michelangelo's response was to keep working. When he could not carve marble, he supervised architecture. When he could not paint, he drew. When he could not stand at the sculpture for long periods, he worked in short sessions. The work continued until physical capacity ended. This was not heroic persistence. It was the behavioral pattern of someone whose entire identity was organized around skilled labor, who had no practice with rest or alternative sources of meaning. Stopping was not a choice he could make. It was something that happened to him when his body failed. The control he sought was fundamentally unavailable within the system he worked in. Artists in early modern Italy were not autonomous agents pursuing personal visions. They were skilled laborers working within patronage structures that determined subject matter, scale, medium, and timeline. Michelangelo's exceptional skill gave him marginal leverage. He could delay, negotiate, complain, but not freedom. The projects that succeeded were those where his priorities aligned with patron demands. The David served Florentine Republican ideology while letting him demonstrate anatomical mastery. The Sistine ceiling served papal prestige while letting him compose at monumental scale. The projects that failed were those where alignment broke down. The Julius tomb required sustained focus that patrons would not permit. The San Lorenzo facade required architectural completion that funding did not support. What remains is the work that was completed under constraint, carrying the marks of those constraints. The unfinished sculptures show struggle, effort, incompletion. The finished works show what could be achieved when institutional resources aligned with artistic capability. Neither represents artistic freedom. Both represent negotiated outcomes within rigid structural limitations. The myth began before his death and accelerated after. Vasari's biography, published in revised form in 1568, 4 years after Michelangelo's death, established the framework. Michelangelo as divine genius, as the culmination of artistic progress from Giotto through the Renaissance, as proof that modern art had surpassed the ancients. This was deliberate myth-making in service of Florentine cultural prestige, and Vasari's own theory of art history as progressive development toward perfection. The Romantic period intensified this. 19th-century writers needed Michelangelo to be the tortured individualist struggling against institutional constraint, the artist whose genius transcended his era. They emphasized his conflicts with patrons, his unfinished works, his solitary temperament, and read these as evidence of modern artistic consciousness trapped in pre-modern circumstances. The 20th century added psychological interpretation. Michelangelo as closeted homosexual sublimating desire into religious art. Michelangelo as neurotic perfectionist. Michelangelo as traumatized by early maternal loss. These readings impose modern psychological frameworks onto someone who lived 4 centuries earlier, in a culture with fundamentally different understandings of self, sexuality, and emotional life. What the evidence actually shows is more specific and less symbolic. Michelangelo was an exceptionally skilled sculptor, painter, and architect who worked within the patronage system of early modern Italy, producing work that served institutional and patron needs while meeting his own technical standards. He was difficult, suspicious, obsessive about quality, and resentful of constraints. These are personality traits, not universal artistic characteristics. He left approximately 6 completed freestanding sculptures: the Pietà, David, Moses, and a few others. He left approximately 40 architectural projects and sculptural works in various states of completion. He left the Sistine Chapel ceiling and Last Judgment frescoes. He left hundreds of drawings, many fragmentary or preparatory. He left letters documenting contract negotiations, business dealings, and family matters. He left poems that are historically interesting but not literarily exceptional. This is a significant body of work, but not an impossibly vast one. Much of his career was spent on projects never completed. The actual output is limited by the time spent quarrying marble, negotiating contracts, being diverted to alternative commissions, and working at a pace determined by physical carving processes and patron interference. The technical achievement is undeniable. His understanding of anatomy, his ability to compose complex multi-figure scenes, his skill at carving marble to appear soft and alive, these set benchmarks that influenced generations of artists. But technical mastery is different from divine inspiration or autonomous genius. What he achieved within severe constraints, material constraints of marble and fresco, institutional constraints of patronage and church doctrine, physical constraints of aging and injury. The work is impressive precisely because it was made under these conditions, not in spite of them being mentioned. The unfinished works are particularly revealing. They show that Michelangelo's process involved extended physical labor, frequent reworking, and sometimes abandonment when solutions could not be found within available time and materials. The notion of divine inspiration delivering complete visions that simply needed execution is contradicted by the archival and material evidence of struggle, revision, and incompletion. His influence on later art is complicated. The muscular, contorted figures became a style that could be copied, and was by mannerist painters and sculptors who emphasized virtuoso anatomy at the expense of compositional clarity. This was not what Michelangelo intended, but intentions do not control reception. The Counter-Reformation Church used his work as visual propaganda while simultaneously censoring it. The Sistine Chapel became the most famous ceiling in Western art, while being appreciated in ways Michelangelo would not have recognized, as aesthetic achievement separate from theological function. Modern tourism has transformed his work into cultural commodity. The David is Florence's brand identity. The Sistine Chapel ceiling is a bucket list destination for millions who see it through cameras and crowds divorced from liturgical context. This is not corruption of original meaning. Art always serves the purposes of whoever controls access to it. But it does mean Michelangelo's work now functions in ways completely unrelated to its production circumstances. What should be remembered accurately is this. Michelangelo was a worker of exceptional skill operating within institutional constraints that determined most parameters of his practice. He produced, technically, extraordinary work in service of patron and church demands. He resented many of those demands, but lacked the structural power to refuse them. He worked until physical capacity failed, leaving many projects incomplete. This is less romantic than the genius myth, but more historically accurate. It also better explains the actual characteristics of his work, the unfinished sculptures, the patron-driven subject matter, the institutional functionality, the evidence of struggle and revision. The real achievement is not transcendent genius, but sustained technical excellence under difficult conditions. The real legacy is not liberation of artistic individuality, but demonstration of what skilled labor could accomplish when institutional resources, patron demand, and individual capability aligned. Michelangelo matters because he shows the heights of what was possible within the patronage system of early modern Italy. Not because he escaped that system or transcended his historical moment. He was shaped by power, religion, patronage, and pain. What he made was shaped by those same forces. Removing the myth does not diminish the work. It clarifies what was actually accomplished and at what cost. The sculptures remain technically extraordinary. The frescoes remain compositionally complex. The architecture remains structurally innovative. None of this required divine inspiration. It required decades of obsessive labor under institutional constraint, executed by someone who could not imagine living any other way. That is what Michelangelo actually left behind. The residue of exceptional skill deployed in service of powers he resented but could not refuse, worked into stone and plaster until his body gave out.